If you have topics you would like to have us discuss on the Aging Well podcast, please click on the links in the episode description to send us a text or record your message or comments. We'd love to hear from you and how we can help you age well. If you benefit from the Aging Well podcast and would like to support the content financially, please click on the Support the Show link or support our affiliates and advertisers. Welcome to the Aging Well podcast. I'm Jeff Armstrong here with Corbin Bruton. In this and the episodes that follow, we will share candid discussions on aging and hear from the experts. We are here to inform and encourage as we experience, aging. Growing in popularity is the practice of intermittent fasting. In this episode, Corbin and I discuss the pros and cons of intermittent fasting, the science, and who should consider this dietary practice.
All right, so today we are actually going to be talking about kind of a new trend-setting thing within the last few years, and that is the subject of intermittent fasting. Dr. Armstrong, I know you do not like fad diets and you're not into like the whole supplement scene and you're like, it's all fast. What's your opinion on intermittent fasting or fasting in general?
You want me to shut down this whole conversation right away, huh? I think intermittent fasting can work for some, and it does work, but I think it's extremely limited. And there are a lot of factors to consider as to, if you're exercising, how is that going to impact the timing of your macro consumption, your fueling of your muscular performance, building muscle tissue, and all that stuff. Frankly, I think it's okay for short-term fat loss, particularly in the obese population or overfat population. But for most individuals, I would say you're much better off sticking to the basics of a good hypocaloric diet if you're looking to lose body fat.
So a lot of people, they do initially start intermittent fasting, with the hopes of weight loss. And some people, they fast for other reasons. Like there's different types of fasting that's out there. There's obviously intermittent fasting, which you're fasting from a 12 to 16 hour window. There's OMID style fasting, where your OMID stands for 1 meal a day, where you're fasting almost all day long. And then you have a 1 hour window, and then you're just getting in all your calories, hopefully the healthy amount of calories. There's the warrior style diet, where you have a 4 hour window. So you're fasting for a full 20 hours. There's also the fasting style of feast, fast, feast. So you're alternating days where you're doing a full 24-hour fast. And then there's also fasting where people just do water fast, typically about 3 days to a full 7 days, where they're not consuming anything out there other than water. Now, to me, that one seems the most dangerous, because you're not just watching your macros at that point. You're not taking anything in. But by taking in that much water and not any other form of nutrition, to me, I feel like you would have to balance out your macros with your electrolytes and everything to that effect. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. And, I think, it goes back to Shakespeare, a rose by any name is still a rose. I think that was Shakespeare. You can name every possible variation of intermittent fasting, and, it's still intermittent fasting. In fact, I think the whole redundancy of the intermittent fasting, you can't fast any way other than intermittent. The only alternative to intermittent fasting is starvation diet, and that ends in death. So you have one fast and that's it. So intermittent fasting can come under a wide range of methodologies and practices. And really what it comes down to is what works for you. There's plenty of research out there, because the Muslim faith keeps Ramadan. and they fast during that period of Ramadan, they have been able to do a number of different studies looking at a lot of different blood markers and all that kind of stuff during Ramadan. And it doesn't really show any great benefit nor detriment to doing it. So it's really, to me, it comes down to a matter of choice and what's going to work best in your lifestyle.
So what do you mean there's no benefit?
Well, I mean, there's no benefit compared to a traditional hypocaloric diet.
Hmm.
And it basically comes down to a successful diet being predominantly caloric balance. And if you achieve that caloric deficit in 6 meals a day, 3 meals a day, 1 meal a day, you're still in a hypocaloric state, you're going to lose weight. Now, there have been studies that have shown that people do tend to, they ultimately, and people and mice, a lot of these studies have been done on rodents because it's a lot easier to get a lot more information. But they find that they tend to be much more overfed during that period of feeding. But there's generally, I think it was like about a 20% reduction in overall caloric intake. But, it ends up kind of washing out a little bit because you impact your metabolism a certain extent, and you're bringing in fewer calories. Your body might ramp up its metabolism a little bit because you have a little bit greater thermogenic effect of food eating so much so quickly. But in the long run, you really don't see any dramatic difference in terms of weight loss.
I would say that intermittent fasting kind of forces that uh, hypocaloric intake though, because if you're forcing yourself to only eat between a certain window, well, then in that certain window, that's the calories that you get. A lot of people, whether they're at work or whatever the case may be, a lot of people graze throughout the day. They don't even realize it. They're just snacking all day long. But if you have a mental mindset of, I can't eat anything except for if I'm inside my window, I think that kind of forces people to automatically go into that hypocaloric deficit.
Well, yeah, it might, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're not going to go hypercaloric in that window of time. I mean, you can cram a boatload of calories into a short period of
That's
time.
true.
It doesn't take much. And, I think when you look back to what we've talked about recently in terms of what are the healthy diets for aging, a more Mediterranean type of diet, a diet that is high in things like legumes and all that. How much legumes are you going to be able to eat in a 4 hour window? And if you do, how much nutrition you actually getting? So to get those healthy foods in that short window is going to be very, very difficult.
Let's see what John Hopkins has to say. So,
John Hopkins is a place, not a person.
Yes,
Right?
I know.
Okay.
John Hopkins neuroscience Mark Madison has studied intermittent fasting for 25 years. He says that our bodies have evolved to be able to go without food for many hours or even several days or longer. In prehistoric times, before humans learned to farm, they were hunters and gatherers who evolved to survive and thrive for long periods without eating. They had to, they had no other choice. It took a lot of time and energy to hunt game and to gather nuts and berries. Even 50 years ago, it was easier to maintain a healthier weight loss. John Hopkins dietitian Chrissy Williams explains there were no computers, no TV shows that were turned on until 11 p.m. People stopped eating because they went to bed. Portions were a lot smaller. More people worked out and they played outside. In general, they got more exercise. What do you think
Sure.
about that
You
statement?
know, you sent that to me and I read it and I thought, what a load of shit to come from John Hopkins. I mean, it's okay, but there's nothing scientific about what they're saying. I mean, first of all, they're speculating. They're going back and you know putting assumptions on what people did in the past. There's a lot more to why we maybe had lower body compositions in the 50s. I mean, people, yes, they were much more active, but food was different, jobs were different, all those types of things. And to say that, now or back then they stopped eating because they went to bed. Well, how many people today eat in their sleep? I thought that was kind of a really stupid comment. Um, I feel like a lot of times you get articles like that where obviously this guy has been studying intermittent fasting for 25 years because he's interested in it. So he has an investment in promoting it and discussing it. I mean, if it was something that was not effective, then he probably would have given up on it, or something he didn't like, he wouldn't have done the research over all these years. Again, it doesn't really get to, is it really that more effective than eating a normal diet? Or can you get the same benefits from having normal, healthy eating habits? I just don't see it in that particular discussion. I think you have to really look at the individual and what's working for them. What is their lifestyle? Frankly, for myself, and that's what I basically discuss with my students. I said, for me, I have to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning to work out. And if I don't eat until, this 4 hour window in the evening, I'm working out under a fasted state, not getting any kind of fuel into my muscles, not getting protein or glycogen into my muscles after the workout. And then I'm going for, many more hours before I actually eat anything. I'm not refueling that muscle. I'm not growing that muscle. And then I finally eat. And where does that food go? Well, yeah, okay, you could say it goes into the muscle. It's not going to go quite as much into the muscle as it might have right after exercise. Um, and you have to start considering, and I don't think I've really seen enough literature one way or the other with it, but the effects on leptin and adiponectin, the primary hormones that are secreted by adipose tissue in response to a intermittent fast. So I don't think from a performance standpoint at all, it's going to be of benefit. Now, if you're somebody who is sedentary and overweight and you're not really boosting your exercise metabolism, that was another thing in that article. They mentioned exercise, but the way they used it, I forget exactly, but I would not define that as exercise. It's just simply physical activity. Mm-hmm. But when you are not exercising, you have a relatively sedentary job, yeah, it's probably pretty easy to get up in the morning, skip breakfast, skip lunch, just work through the day. And as long as you can have enough restraint not to eat, which can be very difficult, then you're conserving all of those possible calories for the evening. You're going to be in a hypocaloric state. But you're also going to find that you'll see weight loss for a period of time, and then it's going to very quickly plateau. And then what? You can't change that diet anymore. You're not necessarily really affecting your macros. I mean, you might be able to tweak those a little bit, but you're not going to see any real significant improvements in that fat loss.
So are you saying that the yo-yo effect of fasting and then feasting and fasting and feasting and kind of just messing up that window without a full commitment dive into it could potentially have dramatic effects on your metabolism? Because you're saying you can lose weight and then you have the potential of gaining it back.
Well, I mean, that's with any diet. You have a potential of once you go into back into a hypercaloric state, which most people do after a diet, they return to eating patterns that are not compatible with their activity levels, and weight's going to creep back on. And generally that weight creeps back on as fat. Now, if you can continue to maintain a intermittent fasting practice, you might maintain that weight a little bit more effectively, but your weight loss, that fat loss, is not going to increase significantly.
You don't think so, huh? Even if it's forcing the low calorie
Well, I
diet
mean, you
throughout the
can
day.
only go so low calorie.
Right.
And if you're reducing your calories even further, you're going to begin to get into a state of malnutrition.
Mm.
I discussed my epigenetics test with True Diagnostic co-founder Hannah Wendt in episode 162. Epigenetic testing measures baseline and changes in your pace of aging, giving you the power to steer your anti-aging or health and wellness journey in the right direction. I learned that I am aging well. Click on the affiliate link in the episode description, use the promo code AGEWELL, and receive a 12% discount on your epigenetics test and monitor your pace of aging.
Well, and then you also mentioned, if you work out early in the morning and you're working out fasted and then you don't replenish the muscles right afterwards, obviously that's going to have an effect. But couldn't one argue that, well, why wouldn't you just go ahead and change your window? So when you're working out, like that's your window.
Well, some people can't change that window. I mean, I work out at 5 o'clock in the morning because that's when I can work out. I mean, if I don't, I'm not going to get it done in the afternoons. Presently am, volunteering as strength and conditioning coach for my son's wrestling team. That's right after school. That already takes away from an afternoon workout from me, and it's taken away from me walking the dogs, which gives me a little extra physical activity. So my caloric intake is going down. If I move that exercise into my fasting window, and I had little air quotes there, I move it into that fasting window. Now that cuts into the time that I can actually eat during that period of time, which means I'm going to get even fewer calories and less nutrition. And it's also going to impact my performance because when am I eating relative to that workout? Now, you might say, okay, well, do it right before your feast and go from there. And that's what I'm sure a lot of people do. But if you have not eaten for 16, 20 hours and then you try to work out, you're not going to work out quite as effectively. So you're diminishing your performance there. So, again, it has its place for some people. And if it manages for some, it's fine. It's not going to be hugely detrimental, but it's not the diet to end all diets. It is just kind of there. I mean, in most of the literature, you looked at saw a meta-analysis of the meta-analysis that basically concluded, it's got some moderate benefits, but not anything significantly great.
Well, and I think that's why we primarily are picking this subject is it's such a hot topic right now. And a lot of people are diving into it. And they're like, no, it works. It's great. And it's flooded everywhere. Like it's all social media aspects are talking about it. And it's like, well, yeah, you can see results and yeah, they could be beneficial. But at the same time, there is, like you said, there's science behind it. I'm still going to just dive in based off of what they claim out there is some of the benefits, and we can kind of break down each one. So one of the benefits that they're saying is thinking and memory. These studies discover that intermittent fasting boosts working memory in animals and verbal memory in adult humans. Now, that's just one of the claim. I wasn't able to find any studies on that aspect, except for I just found one that was from 2012. And it essentially just says when we're calorie deprived and we're really hungry, once we've gone through that threshold of being quote unquote hangry, essentially where you're like your low blood sugar and you're like, man, I'm so hungry, I'm agitated, I'm irritated. Once you make it through that threshold, your mind and your body kind of become in a state of alertness, almost not entirely fight or flight, but you're just taking in a lot of stuff. You're aware. And that I think that goes into what we had read earlier with humans were hunter gatherers. They went out and they had to be hyper focused, but What's your opinion on?
Well, I mean, it does make some sense, especially from that evolutionary standpoint that, when you're hungry, you're going to be more alert because you're trying to find food. If you're out hunting and you're really starving, you don't want to be daydreaming and walking around and miss the deer that's kind of standing in the bushes beside you. But, from a modern standpoint and productivity in our jobs and things like that, how alert and productive are you during that period where you're hungry?
Not at all.
So you lose all that. And so maybe you gain a little bit back, but it's all a wash. Well, why not be in a state where your blood sugar levels are regulated and controlled consistently across time, and your brain is getting energy and you have a more steady level of alertness?
Now, that kind of brings up a pretty good subject regarding that, especially with like how much sugar or how much processed food people are typically taking in. We've discussed the importance of like that Mediterranean diet, or a paleo style.
Don't go paleo here.
But primarily that Mediterranean diet, which, it is for the most part low sugar. Do you think people, when they're in that state of low blood sugar, they've taken in so much, I don't know, processed food, or, maybe they're an individual that drinks 2 sodas a day, right? And then they just say, I want to stop cold turkey. Well, that's going to have some effect. Your body has to adapt and adjust to that. If you've drinking 2 sodas a day or 3 sodas a day for a course of X amount of years, and then you just kind of stop cold turkey, your body does have some effect to that. I don't know if you've ever just randomly stopped drinking coffee and you stopped your caffeine intake. Like for me, if I don't do caffeine, I'll have a headache for 2 or 3 days. And
Well,
just
your
having those.
body's going to adjust to any kind of change. I mean, it's
Right. But in the adjustment phase, it can be more challenging for certain individuals depending on what it is that they're putting into their body. So if you've spent years of putting in like a lot of high fructose corn syrup and everything, and then you just stop cold turkey and you want to do intermittent fasting versus an individual who dedicated to a very strict Mediterranean diet where they're not taking in any of that garbage or any of that processed food, they're probably going to have in that window of in that window of passing that threshold of, oh man, I'm hangry, I'm agitated, I'm hungry. They're probably going to have a smaller window for an individual who is committed to a more Mediterranean style diet versus someone who's just been eating junk food. Does that make sense what I'm saying?
No, it doesn't.
Okay. If you're spiking your blood sugar levels constantly and you're almost putting yourself in a state of insulin resistant because you're just eating.
Well, you are putting your body in a state of insulin resistance, and again, that goes back to the whole leptin and adiponectin balance that comes from being over fat and eating these really crappy diets. It comes from the stress that we put on the pancreas in terms of managing the levels of insulin and glucagon to be able to deal with these surges of glucose or sugar into our system, and then insulin spikes, pulls it into tissue, typically adipose tissue, because our muscles aren't active and sugar levels drop. And we have to kind of keep messing with everything to try and balance that all out. So I'm not quite sure I'm following where you're going with the idea of shifting from a really, really crappy diet to intermittent fasting versus shifting from Mediterranean diet to intermittent fasting.
Yeah. So one of the claims was thinking and memory. And it said that studies that intermittent fasting boosts working memory in animals and verbal memory in verbal memory in adult humans, judo. What I'm saying, if you have a diet that spikes your blood sugar levels so high, and then you kind of cut back and you're dropping that blood sugar, well, typically people who have dropped their blood sugar level, they tend to be woozy, they tend to be out of it, they tend to be getting dizzy. Versus that Mediterranean diet, your blood sugar levels are going to be significantly lower already taking on that diet. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So someone who's on a Mediterranean diet who then decides, I want to do a fast, they're not going to have as a traumatic effect as someone who's taking in a whole bunch of processed food, a high sugar intake diet, and then that person wants to do a fast, right? That person is going to have more brain fog. They're going to be more agitated. They're going to be more until they get out of that threshold to have that mental clarity.
Okay.
Is that what
I guess.
I feel like I'm being.
Yeah, but I'm not following where you're going with that.
What I'm saying is they're saying that one of the benefits is thinking and memory.
Right. I got that.
Right. Because you're in that fasting window. I'm saying it's going to be, I'm saying we could potentially throw that out because if you're on a diet that's more Mediterranean, you have more blood sugar, and then you go into a fasted state, yeah, your thinking and memory is probably going to be higher because you're in that alertness of, okay, I'm hungry, I need to get food, but I'm going to focus here. Your blood sugar you've trained your body to kind of regulate those blood sugars versus an individual who's just consuming high fructose corn syrup, really spiking those blood sugar levels, and then they decide they want to fast. They're not going to have that sharpness. It's going to take them a lot longer to get out of that threshold as well.
Yeah, well, but that's an initial period. And so if you're looking at comparing somebody that is fasting, say for religious purposes,
right?
And so maybe you're Jewish and you fast for particular holy day that it requires fasting. You are going to struggle a lot more if you have a really crappy diet going into that day. Somebody who has a better, healthier diet is probably not going to struggle quite as much. Same as a person who drinks a lot of coffee and then they got to stop drinking that coffee for the day. They're going to struggle for that day. But going into, when we're talking diets, we're talking about habitual diets. We're not talking, and when we're talking intermittent fasting, the assumption is that you're talking about repeated days of fasting, whether it's for a period of the day and then eating, or alternate days of 0 calories and then, pretty much eating it, at your own will. You might have a few days of adjustment, but once you have adjusted, now you're off of that diet. Unless, of course, your intermittent fasting is, okay, I'm not going to eat for 16 hours. And then the remaining 8 hours, I'm going to just eat this bag of M&Ms. That isn't going to work very well. So the whole brain clarity thing, and as you mentioned, there's only really one study, and one study does not a conclusion make. Right. And, my guess is it was probably a pretty crappy study to begin with. The whole brain clarity thing, I think, is probably what you're saying is it really doesn't matter because of the way people eat.
Correct.
Is that what you're saying?
That's what I'm saying. And I'm saying that an individual who is flooded with either their social media or they came across an article in a health magazine or whatever the case may be, because as I said, intermittent fasting is such a hot topic, and they see that and they read it and they're going to be like, oh man, that's great. That's what I need. I have brain fog all day long. I want mental clarity. Well, and then they try it and they're like, I'm not seeing these results right away. This thing lied to me. It may not be lying. It's just going to take you a lot longer. And hopefully you're listening to this podcast and you're aware of that.
I would probably contend that most people that are on that kind of really crappy, high fructose, corn syrup, sugary diet are not the people that are going to immediately gravitate to a intermittent fasting diet. Most of the people that I've kind of seen that have kind of gravitated towards are people who have already established a bit more of a healthier diet. These are your paleo people and some of your keto people and stuff like that, just gravitate to it. And, they maybe do feel a little bit more brain clarity, or they perceive more. And so for them, the diet just seems to be a bit more effective. And again, that's where the individuality comes in. If it's meeting your health goals, you're getting the nutrients that your body needs to survive, then you know, what do an intermittent fast diet if that's what you want to do. But that doesn't mean that anybody who chooses the opposite direction and goes, so I'm going to go for a higher frequency diet. You mentioned grazing earlier. If you graze and so if you took two sets of people and you had one set that here's your food, this is what you can eat in the day. So all their food is laid out. You do meal prep for them and you're going to do intermittent fasting. You're going to do 16 hours without eating. And then you have, the next 8 hours to consume this body of food. And then you have another group of people and you say, okay, here's the food that you can eat, but that's all you get for the day. And you're not going to see a significant difference in dietary outcomes from those individuals if they've consumed that amount of food. You might see some slight differences in some blood markers, but I would probably argue that you're probably going to see the better overall changes in the people that are grazing over the course of the day as opposed to the people who are consuming it much, much faster.
Well, do you think that mindset also comes from all the years of the previous studies, especially with like bodybuilders or, I even remember growing up in school, they would teach us in, health and nutrition classes, like have several small meals throughout the day. Have like 6, 7, or 8 small meals over the course of an entire day. And that's the best, healthier approach. Do you think it's just a mindset of that? And then this new intermittent fasting is kind of it's so new and that it's kind of changing what we've learned and what we've taught for all these decades. And then it's kind of coming in and just changing things up. You don't need several meals throughout the entire day. You can actually just have like your 4 meals within, a 4-hour window.
You realize this is not new.
I'm aware.
It's older than exercise science, diet, nutritional sciences, or any of that kind of stuff.
I'm aware.
It goes to the dawn of man. Maybe that's what Cain and Abel actually fought over. And there could be some reality to that. Cain, one of them was, I think it was Cain was the farmer and Abel was the hunter. I can't remember which was which. I should remember that, but one of them was a hunter, one was a farmer. So very much that argument of, no, you got to eat smaller meals more frequently and you got to graze through the day versus, no, I'm just going to eat and I'm going to eat, meat and protein as soon as I, kill the animal. And, so that contest has been going on since the dawn of man. And in reality, it doesn't really matter. It's what works for that individual and what your lifestyle is like. And again, it's 50% roughly of your success in weight management is going to be caloric balance. And so if you're capable of fasting throughout the day without it impairing any performances, and you can consume a healthy diet within a window in the evening without overeating, you're okay. If you can spread that food throughout the day, you're going to be okay. Now, where I might blend the two is to look at balancing, and this is where kind of that nutrient timing comes into play. And again, that's a small component of your weight management. It's probably maybe in the neighborhood of, I think about 10% of your success in weight management comes from, and again, so that brings us back to which of these diets is going to be most effective. It's such a, whether one is more effective than the other is such a small component of successful weight management that it really isn't that useful to have contested arguments over which is more effective, because they're both effective in their own way. But if I can manage to eat less throughout the day and I can consume the right amount of right quantity and quality of food in the evening, and I'm meeting my weight management goals, that's great. If I tend to eat throughout the day and yet still be hungry in the evening, and I get hungry late in the evening and I binge eat and I'm going to consume extra calories, that creates a bit of a problem for weight management. And that's where a lot of people, I think, fail in their diets, is they don't manage their meals throughout the day effectively to be able to say, okay, well, we get up, we have a big breakfast. We've been taught for years, breakfast is the most important meal of the day. And we have gravitated to this Kellogg's driven, high carbohydrate, high cereal, highly processed, although Kellogg really wasn't as much into the high process, but somehow managed to create highly processed products. But those high processed foods in the morning, and particularly very heavily loaded with carbohydrate, are what causes to have these insulin spikes throughout the day, which causes to overfeed throughout the day. And if we consume those calories inadvertently throughout the day, and then we get to the evening and we don't have enough calories left and we're still hungry, we're going to overfeed and we're going to get fatter. But if we can manage that, then we're okay. So I really tend to promote more eat with the frequency that fits your lifestyle, fits your training style, fits your caloric needs. And if you have a tendency to binge in the evening, then you want to more lightly load your meals earlier in the day so that you have more calories at your disposal in the evening. And this is where, somebody who really isn't that hungry in the morning and doesn't need a lot of food, and, again, they're not training at that period of the day, and they have a job that is very busy, maybe very active, where they don't have time to sit down and eat as much, or they don't have access to snack machines when they do get that desire to binge on something, and they can just work their way through it. And then finally they get, now I can eat. And then they eat and they have a healthy plan in place. They're going to benefit from that. If you have others who can manage their calories throughout the day, plan their meals, they're going to benefit from that. So I think it really is ultimately going to come down to what are the calories your body needs, what are the nutrients you need, how are you delivering them to your body relative to your body's needs. And, big purpose of this podcast is educating the aging population. And we know that, as we've talked about, the diet of the aging population is getting worse and worse and worse. We're eating crappier and crappier food, and we need to shift toward eating better food. And that should really be the priority. I think for a lot of your more frail old, getting enough calories, period, is quite challenging.
Important. Yeah.
And, I would definitely not want to be promoting to that population the idea of intermittent fasting.
No.
You need to be getting healthier food, and to be able to prepare and consume that amount of food is going to be very difficult. You also begin to have maybe some digestive issues as you age. My mother, she essentially passed because she had a constricted esophagus and it was never picked up, and she just wasn't getting enough nutrients to her body. And, we weren't there to kind of see all of this. Essentially what she was eating was building up in the esophagus, and eventually she would end up purging it. Some trickled down through, and, eating a more liquid diet like Ensure and some of those things kind of helped manage that a little bit better. But in the long run, it didn't serve her well. She could eat if she went intermittent fasting, which, you might argue that's what a lot of elderly people do, because they don't have as much desire to eat. They're not as active. They aren't as, I don't want to, in some cases, their frailty makes them less capable of really preparing meals like they might have when they were younger. And so they don't eat. But when they do eat, it's maybe high caloric foods, and foods consumed in a much shorter window. they may not get as much benefit out of that, and they're not getting enough nutrition. And obviously we begin to see things like, greater sarcopenia in the muscles, greater shift toward increased fat mass, and quite possibly, disruptions in the management of insulin and insulin sensitivity to where they become maybe even pre-diabetic.
Well, we're kind of getting a little short on time, so I don't want to go over all the other claims. I'm just going to speed round it. It claims that intermittent fasting can improve blood pressure and resting heart rates, as well as overall health. It claims that it can help with diabetes and obesity. It claims that it can help with muscle tissue health. And one of the things that it says, which this one I do want to dive into, it's saying that it helps with the overall physical performance. And then it states that young men who fasted for 16 hours showed fat loss while maintaining muscle mass. Mice who were fed on alternate days showed better endurance in running. When I looked into some of the research or some of the articles on that, and I am not an endocrinologist, I think our bodies are absolutely fascinating. I think that each individual has something amazing that their body can do that another individual's body can't. But from some of those articles that I was reading, it was claiming that in a fasted state, your body can produce more HGH. And then other articles that I was reading, which could explain the performance and the strength by having a prolonged fasted state, you can lower your blood sugar levels. So then your insulin levels aren't spiked. And if your insulin levels weren't spiked, then it was affecting your stress hormones, which were getting lowered, which in return was increasing your testosterone levels throughout the blood. That kind of makes sense. But again, what we've kind of talked about throughout this whole thing, if you're in a fasted state, it's going to affect your ability to perform, right? Whether you are fasting, like your example of your 5 a.m., if you're working out and, you work out hard, like you lift heavy. If you're in a fasted state like that, that's going to affect your performance. If you're not an individual that works out, but you just want to try the fad of intermittent fasting and you're fasting wrong, well, dropping that blood sugar level, like you're going to not be aware, it could have an effect. I would argue that I don't know how I feel about the physical performance aspect of it.
I think, the whole performance piece of it, if you're in a fasted state, your performance is going to be less.
Right.
And even for me training early, I'm training in a fasted state. I'd have to get up earlier, or I'd have to kind of consume some kind of, protein shake or something like that during my workouts. And the workouts aren't long enough to really warrant that. So my performance is probably not going to be as great. I definitely see improved performance if I train in the afternoons, because I'm in a more fed state. My muscles are more warmed and all that other kind of stuff. But there's still a stimulus to the training. And then that stimulus is followed by the adequate nutrients that are going to fuel the adapted state. And you have this, spike of, being able to utilize protein, and, protein synthesis is highest immediately following a strengthening workout. And so if all that protein synthesis is high, but there's no protein available,
right, then
you're going to lose some of those gains. And so to make an argument that it improves muscle mass and things like that, it's the stimulus that improves the muscle mass. It may improve some of the hormones, and there is some evidence of that. But there's also evidence, particularly newer evidence, that there is a bit more of a disconnect between, the like hormones like, testosterone and growth hormone and some of those in the stimulus for muscle growth, that it's actually, the growth is triggered by the stimulus and those just kind of assist in being able to fuel that growth and that recovery. And it fuels it through, other channels and things like that. So I don't see that there's a huge difference in the two two diets. I mean, there's such a continuum in there, but the concept of high frequency versus low frequency meal consumption in overall gains relative to your caloric needs and intake and whatnot. But I think there can very well be a difference in the stimulus for that growth. And if you can't fuel the recovery of that stimulus, that's where you're going to see the differences in the performances.
I mean, the only thing I could agree with on that physical performance, and this what's going to come out of my mouth is kind of a stretch, but when they were saying more endurance wise, and when I think of endurance, I'm thinking more of like running, like distance styles. So even though you're being a fasted state and you're not pulling the calories that are inside your body, the only thing I could think of is because you have fasted for X amount of time, you've kind of trained your body and your mind to be more mentally disciplined, where you're like, oh, this is uncomfortable. I'm so hungry. Well, I'm not inside my window. I'm going to stay disciplined to this. And I could only imagine that would also carry forward into a long distance running. This sucks. I'm getting dizzy. No, I'm going to just power through it. And it's building that endurance level. And also maybe potentially having that individual hit a running high, because it would kind of go back to that altered state of mind of I'm hungry. I got to go get food. Just like I'm hungry. I got to go chase that elk down, way back to the dawn of time. I could see that. That's also a stretch. That's not what the research is showing. That's just me kind of laying something out there. That's not.
Yeah. And I'm not sure if I've seen any research regarding, the effect on, say, the fight or flight response, the catecholamines, but that would have an impact on much of what you're saying there. So.
All right. So, summary in conclusion.
In conclusion, just eat a healthy diet, be in caloric balance, and, focus on those total macros. But again, go back and listen to the podcast where we've talked about the Mediterranean diet and healthier diets for, not only for, aging, but also dementia and things like that. I don't know if we've had any podcasts where we've talked as much about nutrition for physical performance, but if we just simply look at diet as the overall content of the foods that we are eating, and then consider beyond that, how do we disperse those foods throughout the day? Then, you can figure out what works for you. Does intermittent fasting work for your lifestyle? And are you, if it's not impairing your performance, if you are meeting those weight management goals, then go for it. If it's not, then a more high frequency diet might work for you. 3 meals a day might work for you. Like we've said repeatedly, 50% roughly of your dietary success or your weight management success is going to be just caloric balance. I mean, we've seen the professor at, I think it was Kansas State University, that did the Twinkie study and, fed himself basically only Twinkies and limited other foods for a month, and actually lost a significant amount of weight, improved many of his blood markers and all those types of things. And again, you go back to things like leptin and adiponectin, I believe it is. The balance of those are all to help regulate insulin sensitivity and, our management of our fat stores. But much evidence is that those changes are linked more to fat loss than to exercise, that there's a bit of a disconnect in there. And so we have to consider the benefits of exercise. We also have to consider the benefits if we have to change our body composition in order to improve our health. And so whether that comes from intermittent fasting or a traditional balance of meals, or better, I'd say it would be to consider your nutrient timing, fluctuating those macros throughout the day in accordance with your activity levels. Having steady protein throughout the day, managing your fat and carbohydrates around where you are training, you're going to be able to sustain yourself much more effectively. So those meals, I train early in the morning. My biggest dose of carbohydrates is going to be right after that workout. So really my first 2 meals of the day, my second and third meals of the day are going to tend to be less and less carbohydrate, more, a little bit more fat in order to meet those calorie needs. Somebody who's intermittent fasting doesn't necessarily have to worry about that as much because their timing is 1 or 2 meals, really late in the evening. So it's all a wash. So I don't know if that's really a summary other than, the principle of individuality comes to play in here. If it works for you, it works for you. If it doesn't, it doesn't. And just try something that does work for you. The main take home is, for our health, we need to improve our body composition to a healthy level. Doesn't mean we have to be 6-pack abs. And I think, you'll see a lot of people that are early into the intermittent fasting are also those that are trying to get this super lean, which in itself is not healthy at all either. But, get to a healthy body composition, eat healthy foods, eat those foods that we've talked about that are beneficial to brain health and longevity, and exercise, and don't smoke.
Don't smoke. All right. And always remember, keep aging well.
Keep aging well.
Thank you for listening. I hope you benefited from today's podcast. And until next time, keep aging well.